Hi everyone, welcome back to Vino Wonders. So today's another episode of Let's Fight. But this is a very special episode because unlike the other Let's Fight episodes where I kind of have one question and we present two sides of the argument, today's episode isn't really going to be an argument. It's more going to be a discussion on beauty and the place of beauty in a post-human world or in a post-human centric setting. So joining me today is my friend Akire. That's her nickname. But her real name is Erika Carreon, and she's one of the co-founders of Plural Online Journal. She's also half of the indie publishing duo Occult Razor with Neobi Gonzalez. She completed her BA and MFA at the La Salle University, Manila, and she used to teach at the DLSU Literature Department. Currently, she's taking her PhD at the University of Melbourne with an interest in eco-fiction. So, hi, Akira!
Hello. Thanks for inviting me to our little cheeky.
It's my pleasure. Okay. So today, while we're discussing beauty, we're also going to be doing our makeup, just to add another fun layer to this discussion. And to give you guys some background also on how Akira and I know each other, she was my editor in college back when I was in the pro section of Malate Literary Folio. Yeah, so so she's sort of, I guess, been one of those people that I've always looked up to when it comes to literature tangential things. And now she's taking up her PhD in Melbourne, and yeah, she's joining us all the way from Australia. And yeah, so maybe Akira, you can start by telling us a little bit about your current interest in creative writing and your interest in eco-fiction.
Okay. So yeah, my
I'll start putting on my makeup. Just go.
Oh yeah, I should do that. Like so. Let's start with my brows. Because brows are life. Anyway, so my current preoccupation is an eco-fiction, which I didn't used to be particularly interested in it. I'm more of a fantasy, magic realist, sci-fi kind of girl. But I was asked to participate in this anthology that's I think it's about to come out later this year, called Sigwa. It's a climate fiction anthology. So that was the first time I had seriously considered devoting my fiction to eco-fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And prior to that, I had some preconceived notions of eco-criticism and eco-fiction that I guess admittedly made me a bit dismissive of the genre, if only because it was young back then. I didn't quite understand yet what it is as a critical framework or a potential sub-genre of fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the invitation to write for the Sigwa anthology, I was asked, it gave me the opportunity to seriously consider what it is to write not just about climate change, but my position as a creative writer, an intellectual, an artist, given the things that are happening around us, which I guess is also related to why I, of late, have been personally interrogating my relationship, or I guess my relationship as an artist to the notions of beauty in my work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're right. Very. I think, like, just to give people on this channel some context also, because I talk about Catherine Valente a lot. Akira was the one who introduced me to her work, so I feel like your work in the past, anyway, like what I've read from it, is work that favors language that is very beautiful, like very aesthetically beautiful.
Yeah, yeah, just to extend that a bit, I suppose I'm much like you. I'm interested in stories that are very inward looking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a friend of mine kind of made a joke about my work some time ago, describing my work as about domesticity. So, cue the judgmental laughter. Um, yeah, but given that my work is very that, concerned with very lyrical language, concerned with very inward journeys, whether it's in a magical setting or in
Mm,
a sci-fi setting. Um, it made me writing eco-fiction made me think about um, what is the place of aesthetics of beauty, because I mean, if we if we is it right to say pick the occupation of being creative writers,
yes.
or is it an occupation, question mark? uh, if we choose to be artists and creative writers, and I think we are fundamentally drawn to questions of beauty.
Mm,
I think at some point, like we are concerned with the ideas of what writing or what aspects of life do we find beautiful. I think at
right.
some point, people who have become artists or are artists have thought of this question before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Uh,
It's one of the first things I think that we're kind of called to address, right? Like, what do you elevate to the level of art, with sort of that implication that whatever you elevate has to be beautiful, or like beauty is tied into the thought of that elevation.
yeah, precisely. So when I was invited to join this anthology, one of the things that were asked of us is to read an essay by Nick Admison.
Mm-hmm.
So that's called Six Proposals for the Reform of Literature in the Age of Climate Change.
I'll be
Did I
leaving the
get that?
links to everything in the description bar. So if you guys are interested, of course, I'll be putting in like some visual aids also. But if you guys want to read the whole thing, I'll be linking it below. Sorry, go on.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I'll be going back to that essay later, um, but reading that essay kind of made me think about the tensions that exist within me about how do I reconcile
Mm-hmm.
um, being a creative writer, being and liking that, and being an artist, and liking being an artist, and exploring these questions about beauty with um, with what is happening in the world.
Right.
Um, so I feel like I'm always I have this writerly anxiety coming from the tensions that exist within that, like by being self-reflective about that, like, oh, what does it
Mm.
mean to think about beauty given especially now that there's a global pandemic to add to that.
Yeah.
Not Yeah, I mean the questions about the pandemic, I think, are also very linked to questions about um the Anthropocene.
Mm-hmm.
So just we're going to be now and then using the term Anthropocene to mean a term that describes this geological era
Mm.
wherein human activity has greatly impacted um, the environment, the earth, and all life functions that are associated with it.
Right.
Uh, so yeah, it's so those are some of the kinds of questions that I've started to ask myself now that I have chosen for my PhD to actually write about to write in that mode of eco fiction. Um, yeah, so those are that's the kind of preoccupation that I have right now.
Mm. So you sort of were talking about thinking about like the post Anthropocene. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Like what is that? sort of look like? Like, what are the different perspectives now on humanist versus post-humanist thought? Because I think a lot of people, upon first hearing the term post-humanist, sort of have like this vision of humans suddenly not existing and like the whole world is run by robots.
Well, don't we have that anxiety right now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matrix, or something. I don't know. But I mean, we've always have that preoccupation with um, uh, how technology intervenes
Mm-hmm.
with our concepts um, of humanity. So, okay, why is considering questions about the Anthropocene related to humanism
Yeah.
or post-humanist? So, this all goes back to the question of what is a human.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that's I'll preface it by saying that that's a very we're working with a Western framework of being a human here. Like I just I said what I said, but it's true, right? So like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
when you say humanist, for those of you who have taken up like introductory art classes or who have studied the Renaissance, it's a term that you'll be familiar with, which is basically um, talks about this notion that the human versus as opposed to God or some other force being the center of existence or the center of the universe. So a humanist way of thinking is revolves around philosophy concepts that
Mm-hmm.
have to do with putting the human in the center of the universe.
Right.
That's why a lot of people, when they talk about art periods, talk about the Dark Ages
Mm.
as this period, intellectual period in the West, where God um, verse rather than the individual um, is like the locus or the focal point of everything. It's what anchors everything. And
Mm-hmm.
then came the classical intellectuals who are very much inspired by Greek classical philosophy, rationality, um,
Logocentrism.
order. Yeah, those all feed into the philosophy of what it is to be a human being, a civilized human being.
Right.
Which, if you think about it, from a humanist perspective, is almost redundant to say civilized human, because to be human is to be part of a civilization.
Right.
So,
Right.
so if you think about it, a lot of our notions of being human revolve around those things, right? About what it is to belong to a civilization, what it is to be a
Mm.
rational, civilized human being. And if you look at, for example, um, the humanities, what are the things that we study under the humanities? We study politics, art, literature, culture,
Right.
language,
Mm.
and in a way, these disciplines have to do with examining questions of humanity, of what it is
Right.
to be a civilized human. I mean, to like really simplify,
Mm.
um, humanities as a whole. So when you look at post-humanist, and that's something that's also relatively new to me as well. It's really kind of wedded into a lot of um, eco-critical scholarship, because you're talking about what's next after the human, especially now that we have technological interventions that remake our notion
Right.
of human,
Mm.
where our categories of human versus non-human are being eroded or remade or dissolved or redefined um, by um, by these new um, developments. So that's so how does that kind of change the way that we see the human. A lot of post-humanist scholarship deals with those questions. I usually encounter Donna Haraway, who wrote the Cyborg Manifesto, as an example of what post-humanist means.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, that post-humanist thought deploys the word cyborg to talk about the idea or the figuration of the human as a hybrid form. So yeah, those are some of the related concepts when it comes to like contrasting like a humanist perspective towards humanity and a post-humanist.
Right. And I guess where beauty sort of falls into that is that favoring of whatever is human or civilized or elegant, shall we say,
Mm, yeah.
yeah, as somehow like better or superior to whatever is deemed like savage or even unhuman, right?
Yeah, because to say that something is human means that you have to consciously or unconsciously exclude
Mm-hmm.
from those categories. So, which is why these questions about what is the post-human or the questions that post-humanist scholars ask, very much integral to thinking about the place of the human and thinking about the place of beauty. I
Mm-hmm.
think in when you as a creative writer try to imagine a world beyond the anthropocentric um, world, like or the post like a lot of post-apocalyptic narratives, for example, are always asking about, okay, when the trappings of civilization have ended, where does that leave the question of the human?
Right. And I feel like in most popular post-apocalyptic literature, the ending always seems to propose something like either the recovery of this old civilization or the persistence of humankind beyond that, like beyond what we've lost.
Right, yeah, yeah, that's an excellent way of putting it. Actually, there's yeah, there's always that tension between going forward versus going back, what does that entail? So yeah, as a fictionist trying to cast my vision forward into the
Mm.
future in my eco fiction,
Tell us what
I
you
have,
see.
that's the thing, I don't know, right? Which is why I'm pondering this question about beauty in the first place, because it's such a loaded concept to think about beauty, right?
Right. And I think there is this sort of maybe inherent or maybe conditioned bias that if something is beautiful, then it must be good or it must be better, right? And maybe we can talk a little bit about Kingmaker, which is a documentary. For those of you guys who are not from the Philippines, there's this documentary called Kingmaker, which sort of focused on Imelda Marcos, who was the first lady of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos, and how she was very obsessed with beauty and sort of was obsessed with beauty and extravagance and elegance at the expense of everything else, really.
Yeah, because when we, yeah, when you think about the word beauty, what sort of platitudes do people usually say about beauty? It's in the eye of the beholder. It's what
Mm,
makes life worth living. You have a lot of notions of beauty as this transcendental thing.
yeah.
Um, like I'll briefly mention that this documentary before I jump to Kingmaker. It's called Why Beauty Matters. So, Why Beauty Matters is a documentary by a conservative philosopher named Roger Scruton. So he basically is trying to justify why we must return to conservative or traditional notions of beauty, which are mostly classical,
Mhm.
Greco-Roman, Western, pre-modern notions,
Yeah.
pre-modernist. I mean, so what he's basically saying is, to really simplify his point, modern art is crap because he's saying that the crappiness or the modernist arts disregard for traditional definitions of beauty is a reflection of the degeneration of modern civilization.
Right.
That is his premise.
Mm.
If you try to Google Roger Scruton, you're going to see some delightful past opinions such as homosexuality is like a degenerate way of life or
Oh
things
my
like that. So,
God.
but the reason why I bring that up is because that is an example of how beauty can have a very insidious side to it. That
Right.
it's not, and why I say beauty is such a loaded term, because it can be attached um, to notions like that, like what is beautiful must necessarily also bring into question what you consider ugly. And
Mm.
when you build around binaries like that, it'd be interesting to see what falls under those categories. So goes back to, again, what you consider human versus non-human, what you consider civilized versus um, uncivilized. So um, that's a very stark example, I think, of what I'm talking about, with what I say, with my ambivalence towards um, beauty, because I also attach it to these notions, which brings me to Kingmaker,
Yeah.
which I had recently watched. I mean, Kingmaker, if you're from the Philippines and if you had a really good education, Kingmaker isn't really saying anything super new,
Mm-hmm.
but it reminds us about how beauty has been weaponized by fascism. So it's fascinating and also a disturbing look into how many into how beauty is so wedded into the Marcos dictatorship. It, and you can see into how Imelda Marcos's mind really works.
Yeah.
Um, how she talks about I made me and Ferdinand, we made the Philippines beautiful, and she talks about Ferdinand in the, like, she refers to him not in his first name but as Marcos.
Marcos.
Right. Um, yeah, like how and you juxtapose um her philosophy on beauty. You juxtapose that with the material conditions of the Philippines right now. You see that she likes to think of herself as beautiful. She likes to surround herself with beauty. There's that well-known phrase to describe Imelda as having an edifice complex. She likes to build, build, build. It is that, and those edifices that she had built are an extension of that philosophy of beauty,
Right.
um, that that is part of the dictatorship's nation building project. And again, you ask yourself the question: what is excluded um, in this notion of beauty? When she calls something beautiful, what is her notion of not beautiful? What
Right.
is the cost um, of beauty?
Yeah.
Um,
And
when
sort of,
in addition to that, yeah.
and going off of that also, I'm reminded of a part in that documentary about the San Juanico Bridge and
Oh yeah.
how when they built the San Juanico Bridge, it was called the Lovers Bridge because there's this famous photo of Imelda and Ferdinand Marcos on the bridge, and they sort of I guess like the propaganda for that was that it was the bridge of love. But then the authorities who would torture activists like professors, students from the University of the Philippines would have this form of torture called the San Juanico Bridge, where the person would be made to lay down like between two beds until their whole body basically became numb, and then the soldiers would sort of step on their stomachs. So there's that sort of juxtaposition between beauty and torture, and like who gets to call an object something beautiful and something you can associate with wishes and elegance, extravagance, and who gets to sort of pay the price and be the subject of torture.
It's also called the Bridge of Love because it's allegedly a gift
Right.
by Ferdinand to
Imelda.
Imelda. So notions of love and beauty and nature being beautiful. It's also very much related to romanticism.
Mm.
Um, and that's another thing that Nick Admerson talks about in his essay about how to reform literature. He's basically saying that cultural products, the things we write, the art that we produce, is complicit in our subjugation of the other, in our consumption of nature, in the colonial project, in the capitalist project. Because if we keep entertaining all of these notions of beauty, for example, how many times have we seen descriptions of the natural resources of a country as a justification for invading it?
Right.
If you see the rhetoric of, I'm in Australia right now, and as someone who comes from the Philippines, and someone who is now like slowly familiarizing herself with how colonization happened here, you'll really find that there's something in common between the land as this unpopulated, pristine, virgin land, terra nullius. Basically, the concept of the terra nullius, which is like empty land for us to explore. That's another thing about beauty being deployed in that way. If beauty is associated with love and desire is something that you seek to possess, you can see how that is also used as justification for for capitalist consumption, for colonization. That's again a very a simplification of that, but yeah, when we do not interrogate notions of beauty or of nature as beautiful, like let's take that famous poem about trees, Joyce Gilmer. Right? What is that poem doing? It is directly making a comparison between a tree and something that humans do. And comparing nature to Mother Nature, a woman. We see that rhetoric a lot, right? Nature as mother. And we could see how notions of the other, human versus other, civilized, uncivilized, you could see all of these binaries. They're really related to each other. Our binaries between man and woman, superior, inferior, rational versus chaotic. You could see these rationalizations between why do we separate and put into a hierarchy man versus woman,
right?
And or the separation of man versus nature. These are all very interconnected binaries. So if you read up, my readings on eco-criticism, there's really a lot of these perspectives on how very intersectional those concerns are. the binaries that we construct gender-wise, the binary, the divisions class-wise that we construct. They're all related. They are related to how we have compartmentalized the world. And
Right.
beauty is one way of compartmentalizing the world in that manner.
And I think like an interesting thing about the Admeson essay was, or something that I find interesting but also find very dangerous almost, is his point about retiring the portrait of a single soul.
Hmm.
Yeah, which on the one hand sort of seeks to encourage I guess like talking about interconnectedness and talking about the human's place in a bigger, like in a bigger web of things, like the humans not as like the center of everything, but just one part of nature, like of this thing that exists. And yeah, maybe I don't know, I just sort of like to get your thoughts on that, and how that sort of ties into our earlier discussion about how beauty can sometimes be co-opted by fascism and by violence.
Yeah, I think when Adbison says retire the portrait of the single soul, he's
Mhm.
basically, I do greatly agree with that. In that we have this very Cartesian, and also in a way very much heavily influenced by Western philosophy, that the
Mhm.
notion of the self, an individual cut off from others, the an individual cut off from nature. And yeah, I do agree that we need to rethink that. And I
Mhm.
think if you since we brought up the concept of humanism earlier, I think we could qualify Admerson's essay by saying what he's talking about it when he says the single soul is a
Right.
very humanistic or Western centric notion of the
Right.
self existing, and the Cartesian self existing independently of other forces,
Hmm.
um, which feeds into that notion of the human existing separate and above the other or other forms of life.
Right.
Um, but from a writing perspective,
Mhm.
that's also tricky to do because as readers, it's also if you're going to use climate fiction or eco fiction as a way to examine or re-examine our relationship with the environment,
Mm.
you also have to come up to problems or the challenges of engaging with readers about that.
Right.
Because Admeson, and then you also see that um, in other eco critics talking about this. Um, how do you go beyond the self,
Mhm.
represent the enormous time scale of climate change, or the or take on the almost impossible or the enormous challenge of representing the multifaceted um, problems of climate change, or the multifaceted um, nature of existence um, that is beyond human centric. Um, there is also like the challenge of you losing your audience or losing your reader as
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
like from a writerly perspective.
Mhm.
There's an excellent paper that talks about the challenges of that. The title is Contemporary Fiction versus the Challenge of Imagining the Time Scale of Climate Change, by Mertens and Krabs. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing their last names right. Anyway, they basically review three um, contemporary narratives that try to engage with the enormous time scale
Hmm.
um, of climate change. And the interesting problem is if you one novel is able to go beyond the human by it employs different formal strategies to try and um, represent that scale, that scope. But in doing that, the novel kind of loses some emotional engagement with the reader. On the other hand, if you go, there's they talked about another novel that goes in the totally opposite side of that. In that, excuse me, in that it uses the personal. It tracks three different people throughout the novel. While it does represent like a cyclical, it uses a cyclical approach to the form or to time scale by focusing on the individual and their the themes of love, for example. It loses that bigger vision of the time scale again of climate change. So it's a real it's a challenge formally. It's also an existential challenge as both reader and writer of climate change fiction. Like how do you reconcile these different tensions? But yeah, those are some of my of the reasons why I'm so ambivalent towards the notion of beauty. Like I cannot let go of that.
Yeah.
But I think writing eco-fiction, I think calls for a reimagining of our relationship with beauty. If we are to look at our writing as as an interrogation of our relationship between the human and the non-human.
Springboarding off of what you mentioned, like having to balance that sort of emotional engagement with the reader and having to say something. And I guess also there's also an internal sort of tension, especially since we have been trained to write in this way that is very Western, very humanist, where even before we begin to sort of conceive a story or a poem, we're already thinking about like that great human experience, right? Like it's already sort of premised on that. And there's already a kind of pressure for us to make sure that it's not something that's didactic or not something that has like a hidden or like a veiled message. And maybe like one of the big problems, or not problems, but like points of problematization really has to do with form and where form sort of enters into that, right?
Into
Yeah.
that conversation.
Mm.
Yeah, because the interesting thing about Admison's essay is that I mean, I know what he's trying to go for. It's the essay is really nice and succinct about what needs to change in how we write if we are to rethink our culpability and our complicity as writers in generating those same ways of thinking about the other, about nature, that are very much related to the kinds of narratives that a very capitalist or a very anthropocentric or a very patriarchal point of view tries to espouse. It's hard to get. It's hard. It's a really hard project to do. Actually, I think I'm drawn to this other paper. Yeah, as a PhD student, papers are like my life
Papers
right
are
now. Papers are life. That sounds so sad. Yeah, but this is a really interesting paper. It's called it's by Peter Vermeulen. Again, I'm probably butchering his name. It's called Beauty That Must Die. Station 11, Climate Change Fiction and the Life of Form. Station 11 is, I still think it's a beautiful novel that I read a few years ago by Emily St. Mandel. It is Emily St. Mandel, right?
Yeah. St. John Mandel.
St. John Mandel, okay.
Yeah.
So it's about, and this premise is like super relevant right now. It's a novel mostly set in a post-pandemic, post-apocalyptic world. So basically current events. So the interesting thing about this novel, and I know I use the word interesting a lot, and for those for people who have been my students, they also know that I use the word interesting a lot in a very in a very backhanded manner sometimes. I'm sorry. But yeah, it's interesting because this this novel was critiqued by Admison, albeit very briefly, in that it's okay. I'll be talking about a very specific part of the novel. There's a group of people in the novel who have made a museum of objects. And this museum of objects is made up of objects they used to own that belong to them or that functioned during the pre-pandemic time.
Right.
So they have made a museum out of these objects that no longer function that way, of course, obviously. And in Nick Admison's proposals, he used that part of the novel as an example of how we fetishize objects. And that fetishizing of objects, our obsession with objects, is part and parcel of this destructive way of thinking that we have towards the environment and towards the other. It only feeds into what Nick Admison calls progress narratives, like moving forward is still is still premised on consumption of resources, consumption of labor, things like that. So it's so he's very critical of that, of how the novel kind of fetishizes, by extension, our modern way of life, as if the people in the novel cannot let go of the way of life, destructive way of life that we have now, and memorialize it through these seemingly useless objects and turn that into a museum. So I found that to be a very interesting point. As much as I like the novel, I kind of latched onto what Admison said there. Now, this paper by Vermeulen also at some point talks about that same part of the novel. Vermeulen uses the notion of beauty that must die to say that what Station 11 as a novel does to the notion of beauty is to redefine beauty as something that is premised on loss. Now, I find that really interesting. And again, interesting. My God, you can't. Why is the notion of beauty as premised on loss and remembrance a generative motif or a generative concept, rather than what Admison says is like a fetishizing of a destructive way of life? What Vermeulen does here is to show how beauty as the acceptance of loss is a way to generate new ways of life or new forms of life in a post-apocalyptic world. But he uses the word denial. Denial of the loss of old ways of life. He even compares the notion of denial to climate change denial. What is climate change denial but a clinging to old forms of life?
Right.
So he gives an example of one of the antagonists of the novel, someone called the Prophet, who builds a cult that kind of colonizes the different surviving communities in this post-apocalyptic, post-pandemic future. So Vermeulen uses the example of the Prophet as the antithesis of that notion of beauty as generating new forms of life, because it clings to to these old forms of life, one of the things that his cult does is like gain wives, right? That's one of the
Yeah.
things that the prophet does. Acquisition of resources.
Mm.
And by acquiring the acquisition of wives is part and parcel of that project of the prophet, like in colonizing the resources of that other group of people. You're also perpetuating these old patriarchal forms of
Mm.
life, because I have to admit to myself that I'm not ready to let go of writing as capable of. I'm not going to be romantic and say it's capable of change or whatever,
Mm.
but I would like to think that um, in as much as literature is culpable or complicit in destructive ways of thinking, in perpetuating those ways of thinking, um, changing that through fiction is one way that we could try to address. How do we um, look for alternatives um, to that? How do we look for alternatives to older notions of beauty that are destructive? Um, and 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 I kind of like this idea that Vermeulen surfaces through his reading of Station 11, that the novel's form, as well as the plot, the content,
Mm.
the world building that the novel attempts to do, is a way to show us that we can construct alternative notions of beauty as a way of living um, um, with the world, not only with the world that we created, but with the consequences of that,
Right.
and renegotiating our relationship with that world and with each other.
I like that notion of renegotiation, because I think that at this point it's really all that we can do. I mean, like
Yeah,
so much is
so much
uncertain.
negotiation.
Yeah, and
I know.
even like what we agree with, what we don't agree with. On one hand, you fall into the trap of maybe oversimplifying things. But on the other hand, you fall into the trap also of being like, well, then no one has the answers, right? Well, then like
Ugh.
like you sort of end up lost and like, okay, so then what's the point in thinking about it, almost. But I think I guess like you're right, like, and Vermeulen Vermeulen is kind of right in that sense, that renegotiating our responsibility as writers and our responsibility as human beings, I guess, and human beings that are part of this bigger world, and that are complicit in the system that we can't get free of, also because our lives are so entangled in it. It's almost like we're coming out of a fictional world that we were built into, and we don't know how to operate like apart from the logic of that world. So everything is kind of, I think, um a renegotiation now. Yeah. I was
That's true.
thinking, this is like sort of super, super, super beside the point. But recently I was thinking about how your hair is gorgeous. But
Thank you, girl. It's beautiful.
I was thinking about how ahead of the curve Jeff Vandermeer was with the Southern Reach trilogy.
Ooh.
Right?
Ooh.
It's weird. I've been thinking about that trilogy, maybe also because I've been thinking of Station 11 and how different the two are from each other, and how strangely enough I find the Southern Reach trilogy more comforting now.
Mm.
Yeah, not obviously, like, it's terrifying, but I think there's also something comforting in the acknowledgement of that terror. And I remember like a line from the third book, Acceptance, which was like, the whisper isn't done with you yet. And
Ooh.
how, yeah, like a big part of, right, like a big part of the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
catastrophe is already out of our hands. And again, going back to like post-humanism, like we are no longer the center of things.
and to be confronted by the notion of letting go of old forms of life is a very horrific. It's also
Yeah,
a very horrific thing, right?
definitely.
But I think we also have to live with that. We have
Yeah.
to live with both that horror and beauty.
Okay. So
Yeah.
thanks everyone. Bye.